So, hello, good evening, and welcome to the regular Heart of Thriving Zoom call. And I'm delighted that tonight we're being joined by Piers Thurston. And Piers and I, we kind of go back a few years, and we seem to have been speaking at the same conferences recently. And in fact, a couple of weeks ago, we did this the other way around, and Piers interviewed me for his podcast. So I kind of feel like we've been on a fairly similar journey. And I know Piers has got lots of wisdom and lots of experience bringing this understanding into the workplace. So quality of mind in the workplace. Piers, do you want to kick off and just tell us a bit about your kind of backstory and how you got here?
Sure, of course. Hi, everyone. Absolute pleasure to be here. So to give the nutshell of my sort of background, I initially did a law degree at university, found that a little dry, and I was fortunate enough to be sponsored by a company now called Diageo, a drinks company, and I went into their sort of marketing division where I was in innovation, and I was coming up with drinks for 18 to 24-year-olds as concept, which was much more interesting than the law. So I first of all went into marketing and innovation. And then I realized that the reason businesses weren't very good at innovation wasn't the lack of ideas. It was that the business itself got in the way of itself. And it was a people thing, which I'd always been sort of sensing. And then in about 99, 2000, I came across NLP and coaching, initially through sort of Anthony Robbins and that kind of thing. And I totally got the bug. So I decided back then to start my own sort of coaching business. And even though coaching wasn't massively established back then, I just went for it because it looked like fun. And I did that. And then I spent the next kind of 8-9 years collecting lots of tools and techniques in the world of NLP, positive psychology, serious play, symbolic modeling, language, hypnotherapy, blah, 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 blah. Lucky enough to meet Michael Neal back in 2003. And through following him, I then started to notice in about 2008, he was talking about thought a little bit differently. And slowly but surely, I stumbled into the principles. And then by about 2011, I reckon I had it bad. I had it big time. I was like, oh, this is different. I was a slow learn. And then for the last few years, really, since then, I can only really now work from the principles. But I've particularly spent the last sort of 4 or 5 years working out how to best talk to businesses about it in a way that they don't run away or get too bored. So although I've worked in coaching for 17 years now, both in private client and business, my focus for the last few years has been with organizations and helping them see this wonderful understanding in a context that makes sense for them. So that is my nutshell.
Great, fantastic. And so what would you like to do, Piers? Would you like me to kind of kick you off with a few questions? Would you like to just talk for a while? Would you like to, it'd be great if we got to, make it more interactive and people have a chance to ask you questions, but what's your preferred format?
I'd love to ask what the people on the call wanted. I realize there might be some listening to a recording after this, but they don't get to say. But the people who are actually here, I'd love to know what you wanted to talk about and play it around that, really. And if no one comes up with anything, I'm sure we've got plenty of things, Kim, we could come up with.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Right, so Natalie's got her hand up there straight away.
Hi, Piers. Pleased to meet you.
Hi, Natalie.
Something I'm currently starting to use the principles. I already work in corporate and have done kind of traditional style coaching and leadership development, but have been sort of transformed personally by the principles, and now some of the old stuff feels clunky. I'm working with private clients on a principle-based kind of starting to make that practice, and curious how I can introduce this into corporate as well. But I've been working with Kim, and I notice of myself just feeling strange about the God conversation and universal intelligence mind. So I'd love to just hear your experience of sharing that in the corporate world, and how you make it, whether whether you're absolutely explicit or whether you do something to kind of bridge a gap with it. But anyway, I'm fascinated about knowing more than that, with a view to helping me on my journey. So that makes sense.
That makes total sense. Yeah.
Thank you.
Brilliant. So, yeah, Edward, I've just seen your hand.
Yep, just have to unmute. Yes, speaking as a lawyer who's happy being a lawyer. I like to think of myself as a student rather than a teacher of the principles, although I guess in a funny sort of way, all of us who are students and take them out there, are teachers in a sort of way. One of the things that I'm kind of struggling with in terms of talking to people about the principles is, when you've discovered the 100% understanding, the 100% truth, that whatever you're feeling comes from your experience of thought in the moment. I mean, that's a huge and big thing, and we can spend the rest of our lives deepening our understanding of that. But in the business world, the focus, in my experience, is people saying, "Okay, that's all very well, but then what do we do next?" And I'm finding that the strength of the principles as a paradigm is that it's ruthlessly subtractive, which is great as a way of accessing your wisdom. But then, for those of us, and like you, Piers, I've come from an NLP background. That's where I first met Kim. And we get used to having a toolbox, and clearly the principles doesn't preclude you using any tools in your toolbox, and quite the contrary. But in terms of talking to people, who move to what we'll loosely call self-improvement to access tools, what's some of the thinking that you share with people who ask those kind of questions?
Absolutely. Understand the question. Great one. Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Edward. Gina, do you have a specific focus or area of interest?
Not really. I'm just going to sit and listen, and I may think of a question at the end, if that's okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Cool. And Steve?
Nothing specific, although I'm going to my local Chamber of Commerce next Thursday for 4 hours, but doing a totally different thing as opposed to speaking about the principles. It'll be a Tai Chi thing.
Right.
I suppose I could drop some thought stuff in there, but
yeah,
we'll see.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Thank you. And I have loads of questions. So as you say, Piers, we're not gonna run out. So where do you want to start, Piers?
Well, maybe start with Natalie's question, and that might sort of come round, segue into Edward's, maybe. If not, I'll make sure it does. So Natalie, you were curious to know, for your own sort of development as a practitioner, it looked like, from what I remember you saying, it looks like there's a bit of a piece for you that, what do we do about the bit that might sound like a bit of God, or, is that okay for the boardroom? That kind of thing. Is that the bit where you're kind of slightly...
Yeah. What I notice of myself is I shy away from being, really explicit about it. I think where that's coming from is my thoughts around how that's going to sound for people, and if it's going to make them run because they're not ready for it or don't see that. And I feel that that's probably a lot of my own thinking, because it always is. But yeah, it would just be lovely to hear a bit more from your experience, and if you've gone on a journey with that same thing or not.
And do you mainly work with individuals one-to-one, or do you do groups and teams, or does that not matter to you?
Both, and it doesn't particularly matter. I think I'd have the same issues whichever way. Probably less so with an individual, because I'd kind of feel my way.
Yeah.
With the group, I think it might feel a bit more challenging.
Okay. So I can totally relate to the question. For some reason, when I was first getting into this, it seemed totally okay in one-to-one coaching, private client coaching, to go anywhere I wanted. Whatever came out my mouth was okay, but I felt I couldn't do that in businesses. So I made an artificial lid with it, because I thought they were, I don't know, I didn't think they were human or something. And I thought the spiritual conversation was out of bounds. But that has changed for me. And I think the first thing with business, the first thing that helps with business, and this is slightly Edward's question as well, is not many people in the business world are in it for just personal and professional development's sake. Some are, but most aren't. If you're working with businesses rather than people in businesses, if you see what I mean, if you're working with the business rather than someone that's come to you from a business, then you've got to start in the business context. So whatever that is, there's got to be let's call it a bottom line benefit. And one of the challenges I had with the principles was, because it's so universally applicable to so many things, I could almost talk to someone from business and go, oh, this would help, this would help, this would help, the same thing, the principles. And they were like, well, how can it do all these things? And it wasn't fitting in a box for them. So I now talk about it in just 3 areas. One is solving the intractable business problem, which is what Ken and Robin do, if you know Invisible Power. Secondly, helping leadership development and culture development, which is sort of classic L&D territory, but top end. And thirdly, helping organizational change programs realize more benefit. Now, the first thing I'm doing is working out what they want to get out of it. Nothing to do with the principles, because it's not in spiritual enlightenment they're looking for, most of them. That's just a bonus, right? Yeah. So you start with the end in mind, business benefit in mind. What do they want? Which gives you, in my mind at least, permission to go anywhere once they've bought into the fact that you're going to help them get to that end result. And therefore, I know that the most valuable thing they can see, so I'm client-centric, not principle-centric, but I know the most powerful thing they can see is the nature of the mind. And an element of that, of course, is that it's spiritual and sourced by something intangible. Now, I change the language around what I use, and I have done over the years. My current favorite phrase is source. I talk about the source of it all. Now, I'm not saying there's anything in that word. It just seems to be the word that I use at the moment. I tend not to use the word God. But when I define source, I say it could mean God, it could mean Muhammad, it could mean Allah, it could mean the quanta, it could mean life force, it could mean biocentrism. I just say, here's all the things it could be. Let's just call it source. And I do a flip chart often with a wibbly line saying that, right? I don't even try and define it.
Yeah.
But we explore it without defining it, if that makes sense. And people will make their own mind of what it is. Now, because the overall conversation that we're having is something that's going to help them both personally, professionally, individually, and collectively, I have no bother with talking about it. But I tend not to talk about it just philosophically. I tend to talk about how it's integral to the conversation we're having about unlocking well-being and resourcefulness, performance and potential. And I talk about it in relation to, the different types of of the mind we have and all that kind of thing. So I think you've spotted already that this is something that's in your own thinking rather than in the workplace's thinking. However, what I would say, just from my own experience, I rarely dive in there in the first business development meeting talking about it. That doesn't seem to be where I go unless I pick up vibes that that's a good thing. Mm-hmm. I sometimes talk about it to put people off and say they're still interested. That's not a technique. It's just sometimes it occurs to me I want to polarize, and therefore I'll chuck it out there. Mm-hmm. And see who's still listening at the end. It's like a filtering system for my marketing. But my guess is, because this is what it was like for me, that there's probably something in your own grounding that's not 100% clear on it, or you've got some thinking about it. But because business people are just humans in suits, and some of them don't even wear that, right?
Yeah.
Lawyers, as Edward will tell you, are just humans with bigger parts of an intellectual learnt brain, right? They're the same as us all, really. And it's very, very surprising how easily that conversation goes once you get into it. It really, really is. You don't have to language it too much for people to sort of know.
Yeah.
Occasionally I hit a little bit of, but I tend to check this out, when I do, a little bit of religious resistance. If someone's deeply religious, I might just hit a little bit of like, let's just clarify what we mean. But so does that, you may have heard all that before from Kim anyway, but is there any element of that you want me to explain a bit more, or?
No, it's really, really helpful. And I think, what you spotted, what I'm already sort of sensing is that it's more in my feeling and my grounding than anything outside of me, which always is the case. And I think I just need to kind of throw myself in there and get some experience with it to feel my way. But no, really, really helpful. And I'll watch the recording back to listen to it again. So thank you so much.
Well, the other thing I would say, and this might just be my eyes, because of course it's all it is ever, my projector, but it looks to me compared to, and Kim might probably agree with this, 6, 7, 8 years ago when I was first in this understanding that the business world is more open than it used to be, mainly because the pace of change is so fast now that they're realizing things have to be different. So there's more people who are less skeptical about things like this. Now there's a big danger in them thinking this is something it isn't. But so it seems to me now to be an easier conversation to have than it used to be. That's possibly because my own mind's cleared on it, probably, rather than the outside world actually changing. But my sense is you can just see, and there's a futurist guy that worked on my podcast a few weeks ago, and he's very interesting because he spots the trends of how much business world talks about spiritualness and even mindfulness and yoga and all that kind of stuff, and it's so much more prevalent now than it was even 5-10 years ago. So I think it's less woo-woo than it was.
Great. Well, that's good to know. And I'll definitely
outside-in reinforcement there.
Good to know. And I'll definitely check out your podcast too. So thank you.
Yeah.
Can I just add something quick, Piers, on that? Because I agree with everything that you've said. Absolutely. Be client-centric rather than principle-centric. And I think it is an easier conversation now than it was. Again, I'm not sure whether that's just because I see it clearly. But the only thing I'd add in is I've noticed for myself, when I'm conscious of dialing down mind, universal intelligence, it doesn't go, well, it goes well, but it's not as impactful as when I just go for it full on. Yeah. So it's I guess through those reference experiences, I've just learned to, either don't go there at all, but if you're going to go there, don't dilute it, don't water it down to make it kind of business acceptable, because that just comes off as kind of wishy-washy and nothing.
I think that's a very good point. And actually, if you're not attached to the outcome, which I used to be, right? That's so much easier, what Kim's just described. So I used to be attached in a way where egoically, I wanted people to get this because it's the best thing out there. And it was really important to me they got it. And it was important to me that they didn't think it was what I used to do. And therefore, I was almost trying to convince people. And that's not a helpful place to come from. Really, really not a helpful place to come from at all. Now I don't really care in the nicest possible way whether they get it or not. I'm just pointing, saying, have a look. And it will do the heavy lifting for you. And the other thing that you have to be okay with the odd person thinking you're a zealot or a Jehovah's Witness. And it really is the odd person. I don't mean they are odd, although they might be. I mean that they're rare. But occasionally you'll get someone that goes, oh, you can't say that in the workplace. And I go, okay, I'm sorry, blah, blah, blah. But 95% of people won't. But you have to be a little bit open to that. Now, if you're egoically attached, then you're not going to be, which I think is Kim's point, really. Mm. And, to me, it's about serving your client, not pleasing them. And I'm going to go where I think is the best place to go. And I'll mop up if I annoy people. But I think your natural ability to synthesize and be alert to what's going on, and just common sense, stops most of that happening.
That's great. Thank you.
So, should we go to Edward's question then around what I heard there was, and Edward's question was around people who maybe are versed in more conventional personal development and tool and technique and application of an understanding rather than just a seeing. How does this understanding fit with that, and how do I deal with that in the business world? Was that the question, Edward, if you're still there?
I have to unmute in order to say yes. Yes, absolutely.
So I think it's a really interesting area because many people, particularly people, and I'm generalizing here, who have come from a conventional coaching or an NLP background, seem to go through what I would call a hybrid phase. And the hybrid phase is where you see something like the principles, you see the power of it, but in your work, and it may have made some big difference in your own life, but in your work, you're still doing some of the other stuff and some of the principles. And I went through, I very clearly remember the hybrid phase, and it went from like 80% NLP in my old stuff to 20% principles. Then it started shifting, kind of went 20-80 the other way around. And then I remember a time when I'd mainly talk about the principles, but at the end of the session, I'd chuck a technique in just to make sure, and the hybriding was different with different clients, depending on how comfortable I felt about it to what we're talking to Natalie about. So, and I remember having lots of conversations with Michael Neal about it, and, and he was going, well, when you see it, you'll see it. And I was like, okay. And that happened for me in quite a defining moment in the middle of an NLP course when I was delivering an NLP. I was an NLP trainer. I was training a lot of people to be NLP pracs. I used to do an NLP practitioner for coaches course. And on sort of day 3, I said, look, I can't really carry on like this. I need to tell you something else. And then I was like, oh, I really, I need you just to grow a pair and just go with what I thought was right rather than trying to sanitize it. But I think to slightly more what your question was, where most of us face with understanding is that people are, whether they've got an NLP or a conventional coaching background or not, most of society is used to hearing something that has a application or a do or a now what. Most people are used to that. That's just how we've been conditioned to learn innocently. And this understanding can, for some people, they kind of hear it, they slightly resonate with it, but then their intellectual mind kicks in and goes, so now what? And you're saying, that's it. Right, we didn't quite say that, right? And their intellectual mind goes, well, no, there must be something. Where do I look now? Where do I go? Some notes. Have you got a handout? That their intellectual mind goes like, oh, quickly, give me something. It's almost like they've been swimming on their own without a float. Someone's pointed that out to them, and then they've gone, give me a float, please. Have you got anything I can hang on to? Or your little child, as they've been using the stabilizers, actually they've been cycling without the stabilizers. They've realized that, and now they want the stabilizers back. Now, it's very tempting to chuck something in the water for them to grab onto. And you can, of course you can. My personal view is I don't, because it muddies it. And the thing they remember, although they've resonated with this, maybe even quite deeply, the thing their cognitive brain remembers is the blimmin' float you chucked in. So now, if you've got time with a client, you can explain this to them, right? You can actually say, well, what's it, you know, when you said that, and you can point back to them and just show them how that's their mind doing it. When you're doing a kind of a more of a transmit talk, which I sometimes do, you know, you just have to just lead them with it and try and explain it as best you can without having the dialogue. So I think so what I tend to do now a lot more than I used to is inoculate up front and orientate people at the beginning of what I'm talking about, saying, hey, this is a different way of you going to learn something, right? This is something where you're probably at some point going to ask me what the so what is, or how do I apply this when I'm with a difficult person? You know, you're going to ask me all those questions, and I inoculate that up front. And what I mean by inoculate is I say you're likely to do this. And as that feeling comes up for you, I want you to notice that. And then we use it as a sort of teaching point. And actually, it's really interesting with clients because they'll do this when you're in kind of client acquisition mode and you're getting them to sign up. They'll see some value in what you do. They'll deeply resonate. And then their intellectual mind will come and go, but what about this? How long are we going to spend together? How many sessions is it going to be? Blah, 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 blah. And you can go, hey, what are you noticing right now? Because that mind's kicked in again. It's innocent. So actually, you can use it. The fact they want these tools and techniques and sort of applications to point back to how we've been conditioned to do that, and that this is a very different kind of way of accessing potential and growth. So it's a societal conditioning issue. Now, I realised I've been a bit broad there. So Edward, maybe come back and probe a little bit more at me on what specific bit you want me to go into.
No, I'm getting a glimmer, not so much in terms of how I would, not so much initially in terms of how I would teach this, but I'm just thinking about, you know, how I would do this, you know, just in terms of deepening my own understanding. And I think it is, you know, it was a phrase that I used as part of my question. You know, this is a ruthlessly subtractive understanding, and I think that leads us, you know, I've seen talks, you know, headed things like, you know, what if you have all the answers within you? And I think in a way, what we're saying here is you don't need, you know, 23 tools to be more efficient. You don't need 6 more tools for time management. What you need to do is to quieten the busy mind and get rid of the chatter. And the more you learn to do that, the more you learn to cut out the noise, the more clearly you will see the answers that you know. And and I think what you're saying, and it's hard because your intellect is saying, I need a tool. You know, if I want to be more organized, you know, I need 6 different tools for prioritizing my to-do list, or you know, whatever it might be. But actually, you know, what this understanding is doing is pointing towards the fundamental, which is it's there.
Yeah. And I think just to build on what you're saying, I would say, rather than just say to them, you know, and this is being a little bit descriptive now, but, you know, quieten your mind down and it's there. If possible, it's a directional thing, and it's about going, there's a reason why the quieter mind accesses this stuff. So it's otherwise they'll even hear quieten your mind as a tool, right?
And that's the difference between the principles. I mean, people, when I do talk about the principles, you know, people always say, oh, that's like, so it's like cognitive behavioral therapy, or it's like mindfulness. No, you dimwit. It's exactly the opposite of mindfulness. And I don't use the word dimwit. I usually use something much ruder. No, I don't. But I want to. And I think, that's, because what we have here is we're describing something that's magically different because it's subtractive. And people have this symptom of wanting to say, and now what do I do? Oh, I do mindfulness. Okay, so I focus on directing my thoughts. King Canute knew that you couldn't direct the waves. You're just as likely to be able to direct your thoughts as King Canute was to be able to direct the waves. But you can't always say that quite so directly.
Well, I think what you can do is help people see, why are there so many thousands of people suggesting tools and techniques, right? There's an industry of it. So apart from the commercial gain, how come? Well, the reason is because they're all accidentally pointing, without knowing it, to this source, to this thing that sits behind, like in NLP. So I now know how come my NLP worked despite what I was doing, and therefore why I don't need it. So the other thing you can do is you can point people who are very keen on tools and techniques to say, well, what do you think is sitting behind all of those? How come there's 1,001 tools and techniques? What are people pointing to, right? Let's go behind what they're pointing to, which you can't see. You can only see the manifestation and the result of, which is what you think is coming from the tool and technique, right? But there's something that sits behind it, right? And that's what we're pointing to in this understanding. And once you see that, you'll realize the prescriptive nature of a tool or technique is not where the action's at. So you can use it to get behind it and say, this is why all those things sort of work, but don't really.
Well, and again, Piers, if I could just, I think that's great. Just to add to it, like, what I've started doing is like not being so down on technique, but explaining to people that there's nothing wrong with techniques that come from you, right? Because everything that you come up with is a fantastic idea, which is just perfect for your circumstance and situation and you know, that will be a technique, but it's kind of like, it's about where it comes from. We're back to source again, rather than somebody else's insight. You're going for your own, which is going to be every single time, you know, a gazillion times better. But I agree with Piers as well about the inoculation up front. I do more and more of that, I find. Even I did a 2-hour talk the other day, and I must have spent the first 45 minutes doing that inoculation. You know, it's almost like if you're in a room and there's a pillar in a surprising place for people, paint it red and make a feature of it.
Yeah.
You know, that works better than trying, you know, than because if we don't do that, then people just kind of fall back into their old habitual expectations.
Yeah. And I find if you spend a bit of time doing it up front, it really reduces the number of questions that come back. Or when they do, they're very short and you can just go, that's what I was on about. Oh. And I even inoculate the inoculation saying, this inoculation, I don't quite call it that, may not make sense to you until later, but when it does, it will, kind of thing, right? I think the other thing that you sparked in me, Kim, was that, of course, when a technique comes from you, that's coming from your own inspired action and is less a prescribed technique coming from a book or wherever. And that's going to have a lot more resolve behind it. However, the other thing that can mask, though, is people's innocently, invisibly using these techniques as a coping strategy for their misunderstanding of the outside in, inside out nature of experience. So I'm not as down on techniques as I used to be. I used to be a bit sort of egoically against them, just like Kim said. But I will then, even if a technique's coming from their own inspired action, I will check whether they're using it as a coping strategy for a misunderstanding of the causal power of the outside world, because it could mask that.
Yeah.
So I actually think the whole technique thing's is such a rich conversation to help to teach from.
Yeah.
Does that help at all, Edward, or have you got any more questions for clarification?
No, I think it's hugely helpful. And look, in the end, whatever we're going to do, we're going to use a technique to do it. I mean, you can't not use techniques. Just as if in the end, if you want to accomplish a project, you'll map out the steps that you need in order to accomplish the project.
Yes.
And it's also about though remaining open to, like not to get too wedded to even your own technique, because tomorrow, mine could come up with an even better thing that's just even more perfect for that.
Yeah.
And that's another thing I see as well. People will have a great insight, but then they kind of just want to use that. Forever.
Totally. I say, don't let today's wisdom be tomorrow's prison.
Yeah.
And actually, you could say, don't let this minute's wisdom be tomorrow's, or the next minute's. And I think,
because in a sense, what we're saying is we're not so much about teaching techniques, but about telling you about a place where the way to achieve something, using a technique or using something else, will just be more obvious.
Yeah, because in the world, in the game of life, in work, we are creating form. So we will have structures and constructs and concepts that we're working with. So, that's what we're in the game of doing. So it's not like we're not going to use that part of our conditioned mind, right? That I think, at a nutshell level, you could say we're just shifting the emphasis, because the direction people have pointed themselves and the respect is all been the other way, which is into the conditioned mind, into the do, into the application. And the direction we're pointing to has been completely disregarded and misunderstood, right? So we're just shifting the balance of where people now look and what they respect. Because what we're saying is the power lies in the direction you're not looking in. Yeah. Right, which is why you're finding life quite hard work, which is why you're finding some chronic stress, which is why you're not getting quite the mojo you want, which is why your work isn't fulfilling, which is why you have to drag it out, because you're looking in the wrong direction innocently. And we're just shifting the attention to an unconventional area of inquiry that, once you start to see, opens up in front of you like the night sky. However, you need to press pause on your current thinking in order just to start to see the stars to come out. And most people aren't interested in that because of where they've been conditioned.
Yeah, very good. Thank you, Edward. Brilliant, Piers. So Gina, has anything popped up for you? I know you're enjoying not working at the moment. Which is...
I'm loving not working. I'm actually making lots of notes, actually, which is very useful. And when I was nursing, I was very much, medical model, this is what works. Anything else didn't resonate with me at all until I worked in ITU. And some patients, against all the odds, survived, and some that should have survived surgery didn't. And that's where this is really making me think that very much it is all about coming from inside, the will to live, the will to achieve, the will to do this, the will to do that. And I think I would use that as an example with coaching, maybe.
And I think, what's interesting, Gina, is when I used to start talking about mind and the spiritual element with people and the inbuilt design for success, whatever you call it, I used to sometimes be a little bit hesitant about asking people to find their own examples of that, whereas, but I don't know why I was, because it's amazing what people come up with. And some of the most amazingly powerful things that people come up with, they go, oh yeah, you mean like when I knew my mother died, but I didn't know, or when my cancer cleared, but no one knew what, and you're just going, what, that happened to you? They say it very ordinarily. And then you're pointing back going, yeah, that's source, right? But you kind of disregarded it, because it's not respected. And then what we're doing is we're taking that and saying, well, it doesn't only do those weird and wonderful things, it also helps you work out which email to reply to first, right? So it can be totally ordinary and totally profound and miraculous. And it's the same thing. So in the business world, you don't want to leave something profound and miraculous because they won't realize how it can help them solve their miserable customer or their difficult client. So you bring it back down, right? But if everyone's keeping it down at kind of ordinary, then you chuck a few other ones in and say, it's the same stuff.
Yeah.
Otherwise, they kind of categorize it as different.
That's a really good way of showing how the principles work, isn't it, in everyday life?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Really nice example, Gina. So, can I have a question, Piers?
Okay, then. As long as it's a great one, Kim.
Oh no.
No, that might be down to my answer. So I'll put the burden on me. You can ask any question you want, and I'll try and give a great answer.
So I think, and I don't know if this will be. I'm hoping this will be helpful to Natalie as well, and me. And so although I'm no longer in that clunky transition phase, because I just, this is all I do. I still do get clients who say, well, we understand that. We understand you're coming from a different place. But, for various kind of internal political reasons, we want to call it influencing or leadership or better sales or, exit and. I'm very clear about how the principles help people become better influencers and all the other things. But what do you do about that?
It's a great question because so relate to it. So I've been through the phases on that. So when I was hybriding, of course, I would go for it and then just sort of do a mixture. Then I went for a very pure phase where I was like, no. Unless it's exactly the shape and the format I want, I'm not going anywhere near it, right? Yeah. Because it would dilute it, blah, blah, blah. But that was slightly coming from my own insecurity around, I need to give myself my best shot at getting this in. And if it starts off from a funny wicket, then I'm unlikely to be able to turn it around. I've gone slightly away from that now where I don't have a rule to myself, because before it was a rule going, if it's not, now I just look at it on the merits. Now I've got one on Monday coming up actually. And the old me a few years ago would have said no to it because it's a 1-day event. Now I'm like, I do a half-day event or 3-day event. I don't do 1 day. You're in between two stools. And they wanted it about resilience and confidence. And I've done them a deal. I've said, I'll do you the 1 day and I'll position it around resilience and confidence, but I want to have access to the HRD for a couple of hours afterwards, not literally afterwards, but in a few weeks after, to explain what the big deal is here. Because I don't know whether you guys will quite see enough in the day. So I want that back in, right? And because ultimately I don't want to be doing 1-day resilience and confidence courses. Yeah. Right now, when it comes to what I'm actually going to talk about on Monday, it's going to be 5% resilience and confidence at the beginning, just to go, yeah. 94% principles and 1% at the end going, get it? Right. So I'm going to just do them the justice of mentioning it. Otherwise I'm being disrespectful to where I'm coming from. But, so I think what I'm saying there is I used to have a rule and now I don't. Yeah. If I am going to couch it as something else, I'll still really be 90% talking about the principles, but I want back in to show what the real thing is. And I'll be unashamedly kind of upstream in what I think about things like resilience and confidence and why they don't need addressing directly.
Yeah. Yeah.
And if they all get upset going, it's not resilience and confidence course, I'll go, well, I know, but it's something much better. if you can't see that, then I'm really sorry, but I did my best.
Yeah, that's nice.
But I've got over my rules on it. I had rules.
Yeah, I'd noticed a very similar thing, a kind of, the whole I so resonate with the whole purist phase. And coming back to your question, Edward, about, I used to think people were dimwits when they said, oh, this is just like mindfulness, isn't it? And I don't anymore, because there are a lot of ways that it is. I mean, it's in other words, what I'm seeing more and more is coming round to the kind of an opening up of it and seeing how actually everything is pointing in this direction if we can only realize that. So I find myself being actually, unusually for me, more tolerant than I used to be about people who would insist on putting it in a different box.
I tell you what's interesting though, and I've become more tolerant, but I've also noticed that it's coming up less for me than it used to.
Yeah.
Right? Now, it may be that I'm explaining it better or differently. Because I sometimes find myself now going, I'll inoculate that. I go, no, this is not mindfulness. And I go, well, of course it's not. And I'm like, oh, yeah. I knew that. I was just thought, So I'm almost caught myself going, no, we didn't think it was. No, you were very clear about that earlier. I was like, was I? So I think what I find difficult is when you're writing about it on doing LinkedIn backwards and forwards and silly things like that, where that's where you don't have the chance to explain it. So, yeah.
But I like the thing about no rules. I think that's really, that's the real freedom in this. I remember Aaron Turner on Supercoach Academy. He one of the sessions he ran, he said, there are no rules. There are no rules. There are no rules. And he must have said it about 25 times. And we were all just falling over laughing. Because it's like, it's the sort of thing that we like to think we play like that. And then you start to see all the invisible rules that we still have.
Oh, absolutely. And then, like Natalie was saying earlier, when it comes to like a particular segment, like business is this, or even not business, but lawyers are this. So, we even subdivide business down.
Yeah.
Or we do it with people in a business. Well, they'll be okay, but they won't.
Yeah.
And the number of people who I've worked with who have got a good understanding of this and have really resonated, they go, yeah, but they wouldn't.
Yeah.
Well, how do you know? Yeah. Well, I could just tell they wouldn't. I was like, well, I used to think that, and I'm wrong quite often. So it's those rules really can get us. But we have to be willing to, get it wrong as well as right. So if we've got too much invested in it, that's not going to be helpful for a few reasons.
Yeah. Mm. Yeah, fabulous. So, any more questions from anybody? Or I don't know, Piers, if you want to if there's a few thoughts, a few golden nuggets that you've found for yourself which I know is we're not going to take as prescriptions or directions, but just what have you found to be most useful?
Yeah, and if any questions come out as I'm talking, please interrupt me and I'll answer them. I think the fascinating thing about business is it's an obvious thing to start with, but there's such a need for this in the workplace, in business world, not just the workplace, but in the business world. I don't know why there's such dinosaurs, because so much directly and indirectly of what happens in a business is to do with the human element, right? So, and that's beyond well-being, but into resourcefulness, potential, performance, all those things. And for some reason, it lives in this kind of world of thinking that goes, unless it's really tangible and I can see a bottom line to it, it's a waste of time. So I almost feel like the business world, you know, if it was in old psychological terms, has been mistreated as a child when it came to stuff, because it's got like a phobia of it, right? So, some people, it's like, well, who's been and damaged you that this stuff is, you know? So it looks like there's a reluctance to pause and listen. However, as soon as people give themselves the permission and chance to do it, right, it melts so easily in them, right? As soon as they give themselves the chance. So it may look like it's difficult to have a conversation with a business person, right? But as soon as they see a glitch in it, you know, they're like, oh, because they get a sense that the relief and the benefit footprint could be big. So it's actually what they've ironically been looking for, but they've been looking in the wrong direction. So there's a hard exterior and perceived hard exterior, but actually, once you're in, it's as easy as any human to talk to. Of course it is. Now I dress it up to get in the door. I use this sort of quality of mind thing, because I found that's useful to meet people where they're at. But it's I quite quickly sort of drop that and get to what I want to talk about. I use that to get in the door. Just to give themselves permission to listen in the first place. So, and the other thing I would say about working, you know, and this is an obvious thing to say, but when you're attached to wanting someone to get this, whether that's in the business world or your own family, that's not the most powerful place to come from. So I got confused when I was first working in business because I could see the need for it. I could hear people saying they wanted it, but nothing was happening. And I was like, well, that doesn't make sense. They haven't told me to go away because it's rubbish. They've said, this is great, Piers. We really like what you're talking about. It can be incredibly valuable. But then why are they not engaging with me more? And I recognized, although they weren't lying to me, they just had a lot of thinking about how the business was going to take it, the shape of the program, and whether it really, really, really worked, because they're going to have to put they were going to have to take a leap of faith. Yeah. And there's this thing I nicknamed the trust travelator. You know, the travelator is the thing that sort of moves along once you're on it. Yeah. And with the odd client, you would find you got on that, and you're like, oh, they haven't got all the objections you normally get. They just seem to be going with it. And other clients, you would just stall. It was like the treacle, not a travelator. And I recognized the difference, that the travelator was when they were just not getting so in their head about it and they were going with it. And I remember once I said to a client, I said, before we started the 3-day program and with some quite senior people in the organization, I said, I'm really so glad you decided to do this. It's great of you to do something a little different. She went, do you know what? I don't even know what you're going to talk about. It's just occurred to me, I don't know what you're going to talk about for the next 3 days. I went, oh, don't worry about that. And she got on her head for about 10 minutes going, oh my God, should I have checked? What are you going to talk about? I said, well, hang on. Why have we got this far? She goes, well, something you said resonated and I didn't really understand what it was, but it made sense to me, kind of thing. I said, let's go with that. Right. So my top tip is, if you want to talk to businesses, is if you don't feel the travelator coming fairly early doors, there's many, many, many business people out there. So go and talk to one where you do find it, because you can get stuck in the treacle. Yeah. Now, half it's your own treacle, at least, but do you know what I mean? So just go with where someone's got that openness. Yeah, I like that. Yeah, go where the energy is from you and from them. Yeah. Yeah. And I think, we all know that we can have inclinations about where to go and follow that. Because, I mean, that sounds trite and obvious, but it's just as true in anything. And I think it comes back from what we were saying at the beginning about being client centric, and if you turn up with nothing on your mind, nothing to sell, nothing to convince them of, because of your grounding, it's very, very likely you'll start having a conversation about the principles, right? Maybe not in the word principles, but whatever, right? Rather than going in there going, well, I want them to see that this is this and this is this. If you go in like that, you know, you're trying to do something, but your grounding comes through. And we were always told that. And I remember Michael telling me that thousands of times, and it felt like a bit of a thin answer. It's absolutely true.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's just one tip. I suppose the other thing I would say is, don't be surprised if, because this understanding works behind the eye and people see what they see, don't be surprised what that is, right? So you may have a little clue about what you think a great insight for someone to have would be. Well, let's say they're struggling in a particular area of their work and you think, gosh, they would so value seeing it here. I mean, their work-life balance or how they struggle with their team or whatever, right? Now, bear in mind, that's where they got their thickest thinking going on.
Yeah.
Although they must value in them seeing it there, it might be helpful for them to see it somewhere else first. And then you do what I call the dot joining. So going on to take their prickliest thing head on to start with may not be the best way. So I often, you know, I might ask someone, what hobbies do you have? And they go, I like golf, and I like cooking, I like whatever. Oh, okay, let's talk about that for a bit, you know, and or parenting or whatever. And to give them a little dose of this, rather than trying to tackle the big thing head on.
Yeah.
It depends on the context you're meeting them and all those kind of things. But what I'm saying is, don't.
It's not up to us what they see and where they.
Yeah, even though you think there might be a bigger benefit in the one area.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because that's the one they've got so much thinking on, they won't listen anyway. And that's the irony, right? So if we use this understanding for our own gain, we're already at a disadvantage. Which I know is ironic and paradoxical, because given we're in the kind of helping profession broadly. But that's the first thing I tell my clients after they signed up. I go, right, you know all those outcomes and benefits you wanted from the program? Forget them. Irrelevant. What? That's what I'm going to pay you the money for? No, you're not. Right? So now we're in it. You leave those alone. Right? Imagine this is free and you're just listening because you're curious. Because as soon as you attach yourself back to the outcome, you're already at a disadvantage.
Yeah. Brilliant. Well, I can't believe how quickly the time has gone. That's it. We've run out of time. Piers, thank you so much. Really appreciate that. If everybody unmutes themselves and says thank you and goodbye. So I will post a recording of this. Oh, Piers, just say quickly how people can find out more about you.
Yes. So I'm on LinkedIn, Piers Thurston. Got a website called makingchangework.co.uk. Got another one called piersthurston.com. The plug I'm doing at the moment is I've just put a new, well, as Kim knows, a new podcast series out, which I don't mind some more people subscribing and liking. So whatever podcast platform you listen to, iTunes or Stitcher or Podbean, search Quality of Mind or my name and have a listen. Got some nice ones coming up. Had a session with Ken Manning the other day. That's nice. Got some other clients coming on. So that's another way you can find out more about me. But Piers Thurston on Google, LinkedIn, Making Change Work, piersthurston.com. And I really be very open to anyone following up this with questions and things, because I realise I might have rambled on and not answered what you wanted. So please feel free to reach out. Always happy to have this conversation. Thank you for inviting me on, Kim.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Enjoy Michael Bublé.
Oh,
Thank
yes.
you.
Milky smooth.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you very much, Piers. Thank you. Thanks, Kim.